SECfans.com, week 3, and already our second Notre Dame game. We're going to start calling ourselves Notre Dame fans.com. Maybe it's probably already taken. Notre Dame and Vanderbilt. And this is, we don't get to talk about Vanderbilt that much because we try to stick to the bigger games every week. And Vanderbilt's kind of stubbed their toe lately. But this one is so big for Vanderbilt to get this out-of-conference matchup with Notre Dame that we had to talk about it. So I got Josh with me. We're going to get nerdy. Again, reminder, we usually have a computer model, but not until the 4th week of the year. We got to have enough data from all the teams playing each other and the teams they play before we can get super nerdy with the computer model. So it's just us, but I will say combined, even though early in the year without the data is when we do worse, combined, we're 13-3 against the spread this year. I'm 7-1. Josh is 6-2. As long as I'm in the lead, I'm going to remind him of it. And I'm going to remind y'all right now, please remember to subscribe. We got a ton of Notre Dame fans that stick with us throughout the year. It started last year, and they've kind of hung around, and we love it. The discussion's great. Even get a good discussion going with Brian over at Rivals.com, the Notre Dame site. So subscribe. Give us a listen. We talk about non-SEC stuff all the time. We talk about SEC stuff all the time, and that's where Vanderbilt comes in. And Vanderbilt is a team who we've talked about in the past that struggled offensively, and we've said that there might be a little hot seat action brewing down there. Got a great defensive mind, not putting up a lot of points, and maybe struggling with some of their cupcakes on their schedule. But this year, they go 35-7 to open up with MTSU, and they go 41-10 against Nevada last week. And if we're going to talk about a team that struggled with a cupcake, it would be actually Notre Dame between these two. Ball State, or is it, I guess, I don't even know what their mascot is. It's some sort of bird. They are the Cardinals. Sorry, y'all. I slipped up on that one. Ball State 24-16. I want to get into this one first, and we're going to talk about Notre Dame, but we did so much of a preview for Notre Dame, Michigan, and had so much to discuss that I want to, in kind of a roundabout way, review that. Is 24-16 against Ball State something that you're just red flag scared as a Notre Dame fan, or is this just hangover city after a big game against Michigan?
I'm not overly concerned, and I'll be the first one to be a mea culpa that I thought Michigan would probably beat Notre Dame. A lot of it was I overestimated Michigan's defense, and both of us, though, in that game felt like it was going to be really tight. Neither team was going to move the ball that effectively. And I think both of us would kind of agree the big pass from Wimbush won them the game. Arguably maybe losing Metello may have cost Michigan the game. But our takeaway from that, when we said that was going to be a really close game, is we said it was going to be close because Notre Dame lives and dies off running the quarterback and that zone read run spread offense that is very effective against lesser opponents and sometimes ineffective against better opponents. Against Ball State, I really think they got too cute. They asked Wimbush to pass the ball 31 times. And, they were pretty effective running the ball with their running backs, right? Armstrong, well, a lot of it came on long carries, but still 5.1 yards per carry for Armstrong, 4.7 yards per carry from Jones. I'm going to take that back to a certain degree because most of those came on chunk plays. But I don't think their game plan should ever be to throw the ball 31 times with Wimbush. That's not what they are. That's not the way this offense is designed. Now, everything was kind of out of sync, but it had the feel to me of, Chip Kelly kind of going, or not Chip Kelly, but Brian Kelly going into the game. Well, I guess they both run zone read offenses, but Brian Kelly going in this game and trying to practice what they're not good at.
And that is what y'all. We're not in the same room, so I raised my hand to let him know when I've got a point to make, and he actually made it with the last sentence. Josh, what you just said was work on things they're not good at, and here's something that a lot of non-elite teams, when their team becomes elite and they adopt some of the coaching philosophies, and Nick Saban is notorious for this. when they adopt some of the coaching philosophies as they get an elite team, one of those philosophies is that when you play a cupcake, it's not a beauty contest. It's not a 77 to nothing like Miami did to Savannah State last weekend. It's really ugly. And Alabama always early in the season has one of those cupcake games where Alabama fans are super grumpy. It's like 31-13 against Colorado State a couple of years ago. It's a score like that where nobody comes away with feeling good about it. And it's because underneath the surface of what's going on, he's making half of his players play with one arm tied behind their back, figuratively speaking, in that they treat it as a scrimmage and they say, okay, we're bad at X, Y, and Z. We're only going to work on X, Y, and Z unless we get in trouble, and then we're going to go get a touchdown when we need it and go back to working on X, Y, and Z. When I look at Notre Dame's, just their statistical profile in this game, defensively, they were fine. 3.6 yards per carry, 3.6 yards per attempt from Riley Neal, Ball State quarterback. Brandon Wimbush ran for 11 times for -7 yards. That's sack yardage. That's not – so they took an entire component of their offense off the table. And unlike what Sumlin is doing – by the way, y'all, if you don't know by now, Sumlin is where 5 stars go to play like 3 stars, and he will absolutely – destroy any 5-star quarterback's career. Do not send your kid there if he plays quarterback. Unlike someone who took Khalil Tate's running ability off the table as a strategy for their offense, Notre Dame did it in this game to force Brandon Wimbush to be a pocket passer, to work on the thing that he struggles at the most. I think they could have run the ball at the middle and beaten them by 4 touchdowns. So I say all that to say, and I want you to follow up on this because it's not going to be as long as the other preview, but this is a point that I think we need to discuss. Notre Dame fans, don't take a lot from this. Don't take a lot from this. It was 24-6 going into the fourth quarter. They put on 10, you put on 0, scrubs, whatever. This is something that elite teams do. You know, I said in the other video, I kill Notre Dame for not blowing out teams they should blow out. This is not the kind of team they should blow out. They should blow out 7-5 Pitt type teams, not Ball State. Ball State is a safe game to work on things. So I wouldn't take a whole lot from this, and I feel like you kind of agree.
I do. And, you know, the one thing I think you have to start with is what were the positives? You know, Ball State had 3.6 yards per attempt. They had 3.6 yards per carry. Ball State was not moving the ball successfully. They were at any point in that game, really, and they were able to score 10 points late due to some miscues by Notre Dame, but that game was never expected to be in doubt. As you noted, going into the fourth quarter, it's a 24-6 game. And I think maybe Brian Kelly got caught a little off guard by assuming it was a little more in control than it actually was. And I know to a certain extent they did run their offense, but it was definitely a little more constrained. And if they wanted to win this game a little more handily, I think they could have, like you said, by forcing the run, by really trying to ram it down Ball State's throat over and over. Ball State would have crumbled. And that's how you beat these teams 50-10. They weren't trying to accomplish that. So I think you have to kind of keep that in mind and, you know, just sort of accept it for what it is, not take too much from it. And again, we would be a lot more concerned if we didn't have some other data points, right? But we do. They were, you know, you did come out and you were able to beat Michigan, and you were a good team in beating Michigan. You were more successful, really, on offensively in most ways, beating Michigan. So I don't think Ball State's a better team than Michigan. What changed? What changed was the offensive philosophy. And like you said, you know, you used the Alabama example, but Georgia's done it in their cupcakes. 2016, Clemson beat Auburn, turn around, and they beat Troy 30-24. Clemson ends up winning the national title that year. So clearly they're not 6 points better than Troy, but Clemson was playing the game of playing and Troy was a pretty good team. Okay. Now we don't know if Ball State, you know, quite where they're at yet. I mean, they're 1-1. I mean, they did destroy their opener. I mean, granted, it's Central Connecticut What are they? The Blue Demon Deacons or something crazy. But Ball State may end up being a pretty good team. We don't know. Point being, you don't take too much from these games. You move on. You hopefully learn something. They learn little bit about what Wimbush does when he's put in this kind of situation. And hopefully they get a lot of film. They have something to work on, prepare, and improve, and they know better where they're at when they get into a tough game later in the season, where these kind of miscues really will matter.
And for those of you Notre Dame and Vanderbilt fans that don't know, we do get a little negative on this show, so we can't be all roses for Notre Dame either. And I'm going to take a step back to the Michigan game, and you noted that so Michigan has an injury at safety. Not two plays later, there's a 50-50 ball that, in my opinion, was a poor decision from Wimbush that could have easily been intercepted. Ends up being probably the biggest play of the game for either team. Notre Dame's defense, though, we talked about how Shea Patterson had his struggles at Ole Miss, and we weren't super excited about their offensive output. You said 24-17, but had the teams reversed. I said 27-21. So neither of us thought either team would score a whole lot of points, but Notre Dame's defense I did find impressive, just in terms of how they looked faster and more athletic than they had been in the past. They look more the part. If we're talking about eye test, they look more the part. Wide receivers were great. And we talked about how filling in for the wide receiver production they lost was a potential problem. Wide receivers are great. I do think they did show that they've taken a step back at the running back spot. But I mean, you're filling in huge shoes there, NFL quality tailback there. But my concern in that game was they've got a couple of scores on chunk plays that really were the whole of their offense in that game. And they score 21 points in the first half, most of that on these chunk plays, and then 3 the rest of the way, even though Michigan's offense was struggling a little bit. Does that translate at all to a Vanderbilt team that, for whatever reason, is scoring a lot of points? And in my opinion, within this offense, have a better quarterback than they faced in week 1. Now, I think Shea Patterson is the better pro prospect long term, but I think week 1 in a new offense without great supporting cast and a pretty crappy offensive line, is it fair to say that Kyle Shurmur is a bigger threat to put up points against this Notre Dame defense than Shea Patterson was?
I think it's a fair point. And, Notre Dame fans are going to be sad to hear us say this, but it was kind of funny to us because we put out a video on Shea Patterson because we followed him pretty closely. As we said, we were really critical of him going into last year with Ole Miss. We were critical of him all the way up till, he finished the season, couldn't finish it out. And we wanted to just sort of talk about it and what impact he'd have.
And Michigan fans hated us. I think there was a fatwa I put out on both of us after
Right.
the video.
But it ended up, I think, being completely true. Is he a good quarterback? Yes. Does he have a tremendous amount of potential? Yes. Are all the pieces there working the right way? No. And he gets way too panicky in the pocket. He leaves the pocket. I think we were pretty much on the money when our criticisms of him. Shurmur doesn't have all the tools that he has, but Shurmur is a much more complete quarterback. And we're also have been pretty critical of Shurmur at times because in a lot of games he also kind of gets rattled. I think probably Jake Browning is a fair comparison. He's not probably as good as Jake Browning, though now that I say that, I'm not sure how much of it really just is the talent that's around the two. But he's a pretty solid guy. In usually later halves of seasons, he's had a lot of moxie. And he's made things happen, even though he doesn't have the talent around him. But to your point, Shurmur's just a lot more consistent, and he can't make some of the wow plays, but he can still he's gonna throw it down the field. He's more than willing to do it. He'll do it with consistency, and he's more than a 66% passer really this year. So I do think it's probably fair to say that he's a better quarterback, and they can put up points. So I'll turn the other side around to you. the concern I have for Notre Dame right now, and we talked about losing 2 first round draft picks on the offensive line is never a good thing. Notre Dame is not running the ball statistically overly well. They didn't in the opener against Michigan. They were 2.8 yards per carry. Now there's sack yardage and other things factored in. I get that, but Armstrong was 2.3 yards per carry on 15 carries, and Jones was 5 yards per carry, which is solid. But again, probably you want to see that number more like 6 or more because you have long yardage in there. Most of your plays are a little short, and then Wimbush was only 3 yards per carry. And so when the Ball State game, again, 2.9 yards per carry. Armstrong was better at 5.1. Jones is 4.7. It's still Ball State. It's not great. So a concern of mine flipping this around is if Shurmur is better, Shurmur is able to put some points on the board. My concern is I would have thought last year Notre Dame would be able to run the ball, overwhelm Vanderbilt, and wear them down and be able to just grind out a win by putting up a lot of points in the third and fourth quarter. I'm not sure Notre Dame's able to do that. So is the lack of a run game going to keep Notre Dame from pulling away such that Shurmur has a chance to make an impact on this game by hitting 1 or 2 big plays?
Well, and I think it's a fair question, but I think it's one of those things where we're in week 2 and you and I are both so reliant on data because we're a data-driven, statistics-driven channel that it's hard to know how much of this is because they started with against a good defense in a huge matchup and then had a tune-up game where they worked on the things they were poor at, or the fact that, look, you're replacing Josh Adams, you're replacing over 1,400 yards on the ground. He was, and not a huge part of the passing game, but 1,400 yards on the ground. And then if you talk about it, you're really replacing 2 running backs if you're looking at it statistically, because you're replacing Adams on the ground at running back. And then in game 2 for Wimbush, you're replacing basically your backup running back because he had the second most yards on the ground last year because you're forcing him to be a pocket passer. So I don't know if you can holistically make any observations statistically. I do understand that, you're not getting a huge amount of production from the backs, but I wonder how much production you get if in that second game you don't have Wimbush playing with one arm proverbially tied behind his back. I don't know. I say that because, on one hand, we say Vanderbilt's got a great defensive mind at head coach. They're a hard-nosed defensive team. They're going to stop the run defensively. But you can probably provide me some numbers from last year that don't really fit with that, which tell me, and we're not going to do our predictions yet, but we're going to get to them in a minute, which tell me that Vanderbilt, to win this game, is going to have to score at least in the upper 20s based on what we saw last year.
Yeah, I mean, Vanderbilt gave up 5 yards per carry or more against most of their quality competition last season. They gave up 7.5 to Alabama, 7.8 to Georgia, over 6 yards per carry to Ole Miss, almost 6 yards per carry to South Carolina. Even the poorer rushing teams in the conference, Missouri had almost 5 yards per carry. Kansas State had 5.7. Florida had over 4, which Florida off and on was pretty terrible. Part of the problem is Vanderbilt schedules a pretty weak non-conference slate. Traditionally, this is pretty interesting in and of itself just to see them play a marquee out-of-conference game. And they also play in the East, which the SEC East last year was particularly bad, especially offensively. But yeah, their run defense, it had a lot of issues. Now, one of the interesting things we did the Alabama Vanderbilt game last year because Vanderbilt went into that game either ranked or borderline ranked in a lot of polls because they just beaten Kansas State. We were really concerned because we look back at who Kansas State, they played Middle Tennessee State, Alabama A&M, and Kansas State. And basically we pulled it down and said, look, these 3 teams, all who they'd played was all FCS teams. We had no idea how good any of them were. And there were a lot of signs that the teams they played in were really, really bad. And we predicted a major blowout. And like, as we often do on the show, we're not afraid to pick blowouts if we think they're the case. It was a brutal 59-0 game. And one concern I have too, and this is why I haven't gone too hard with Vanderbilt. We got the same problem this year. Vanderbilt played Nevada. They played Middle Tennessee State. They're quote unquote cupcake teams that you don't want to take too much from to start with. Nevada, there was a time when they were really good. And then Colin Kaepernick went to the pros to not play football. That's a different story. But Nevada and Middle Tennessee State, their other opponents were both FCS teams. So we have no leg to stand on with Vanderbilt. We have no idea how good their opponents have been to this point. So we have no frame of reference for what Vanderbilt's statistics are now. They've been doing pretty well. 41-10 over Nevada sounds pretty darn good. We have no idea how good or bad Nevada is. So given that Vanderbilt also has a lot of turnover, even as statistics driven as we have, at least we enjoy the fact that we can talk about Notre Dame, Michigan, and have some idea that Michigan is a pretty good football team, especially defensively, and get something to draw from with Notre Dame. And a lot of the Ball State commentary came from that. Vanderbilt, we have nothing.
Yeah, and last year they beat MTSU 28-6. This year 35-7. Last year Kyle Shurmur was 10.0 yards per attempt. This year, last year 10.6. This year 10.0. It seems a lot like the Vanderbilt from last year. My concern about the Vanderbilt from last year, I was never as high on Ralph Webb as everybody else was. And even last year, Blasingame outperformed him in a number of games. My concern against Notre Dame is, as much as I think Shurmur is a better quarterback in this scheme to potentially put up some points against Notre Dame, I don't think they're going to be able to run the ball. And what we've seen with Shurmur is, and it's really with almost any quarterback, but what we've seen with Shurmur is if he doesn't have a running game to support him, it gets bad fast. And I could see that happening against Notre Dame.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of concerns there. Now thankfully, they have a lot of returning starters on the entire offensive lines back, but like you said, they don't have Webb. We're not sure how much that matters and where the running backs are. I think a big key here is, Duncan and Sherfield were only the second pair of wide receivers in Vanderbilt history to catch at least 50 passes in a season. So the receiving core is also very unproven. Our point that we kind of went on about with the scheduling is their scheduling was very similar last year with very similar issues. Kansas State was at least a little bit of a better opponent. And for our first video then, and we kind of flagged it and said this may all be a mirage, and we kind of thought it was, and it turned out to be. As good as Vanderbilt looks right now, there's nothing in their schedule that looks any different than it did then. And Vanderbilt was not a great team, frankly, last year. They may turn out to be better than we expect, but as of right now, what we're seeing there's not really any indication that this is a different team than they were last season. There's some things that maybe look a little better, some things that maybe look a little worse. But as far as everything that's available to me, as much as we want to say they're better, it's the same daggum story that they had last year going about the same part of the season. I have no reason to think it's changed. So I figured this is the same Vanderbilt team that I had until proven otherwise.
Yeah, and I do think they're better than last year. I love that Kyle Shurmur got 32 attempts against Nevada. I love that kind of Vaughn was running the ball well, and they didn't get Blasingame involved that much. They had a kind of everybody at the running back spot got a lot of attempts, but quarterback, we're getting Shurmur as many reps as we can to get him ready for Notre Dame. I love that. 23 of 32, 258 yards, 8.1 per. Like you, I don't know what this means from year to year, but I do like the fact that Shurmur's been around this program a while. He's been in the scheme for a while. I'm more confident in him than I think I have been with him in Vanderbilt offense in the past. Not necessarily to put up a lot of points. And here's where I'm going to go with my pick. And I don't know if you're ready to go into picks, but here's where I'm going to go with my pick. Maybe we can both give our picks and talk a little bit after. I think the positives of Kyle Shurmur in this game are what keeps it from being a blowout. In that I still think Notre Dame wins the game, but I think that we don't see like we saw, like for example, we see with Alabama sometimes. We saw this weekend. It was 40-0 with 6 minutes left in the second quarter against Arkansas State, because when you have three and outs and you score fast, that's just what happens. I don't think Kyle Shurmur's ability is going to translate to a lot of points. But I think what it's going to translate to is longer fields for the Notre Dame offense and long clock consuming drives, because they're going to shorten the game. Clock consuming drives against the Notre Dame defense instead of three and out city and short fields, which leads to maybe not the blowout that Notre Dame's looking for, but a respectable enough game for Notre Dame that it's something they can build on. I'm obviously, I think Notre Dame, I'm a respectable enough game for Vanderbilt that they can build on. I'm going Notre Dame 34, Vanderbilt 17. What do you think about that score, and what do you think about what I said specifically with Kyle Shurmur maybe keeping them on the field a little more?
I think it's a fair point. And it's, to me, the difficulty in this matchup is going to be trying to gauge how much the run games work for either team and how that's going to play into drive length. I think Shurmur will have some success, but I think really you've got to give a lot of credit to Notre Dame's defense. And we talked about the fact that in the Ball State game, it was miscues that caused points late. Ball State couldn't move the ball. And I'm honestly a little more pessimistic than you in Vanderbilt's ability to move the ball, because when Shurmur has played better defenses historically, he struggled pretty badly. And I mean, I guess I can't get that out of my head, right? And he's had some better games, but he's traditionally been a sub 6 yard per attempt, sub 60% passer when facing any sort of top 25 defense. Last year, they didn't face very many good defenses. They faced Alabama. He had 4 completions for 18 yards for 1.2 yards per attempt. In Georgia, 5.5 yards per attempt. And he had 170 yards, but he had it on over 30 passes. So I don't think Vanderbilt's going to move the ball very well. I think I'm going to be generous and give him 10 points, but I think that's about where you're at. And then the flip side is, can Notre Dame run it? And I think that's a genuine question and concern. And we haven't really seen that because of how chunk plays worked in the Michigan game. Ball State showed a little bit of concern with it, but this is the sort of the flip side. Vanderbilt was 101st in the country in rushing yards per game allowed last year. They were quite poor. And my curiosity is Notre Dame good enough to exploit that and generate a lot of yardage? I think they're good enough to make it work, but I think, and I don't think people are going to walk away with a huge negative, but I don't think it's enough to dominate the game because of the trouble they've had against Ball State and Michigan, and I think there's warning signs there. So my prediction is 37-10. And I think it could be kind of like you said, a little close going in late in the game and they finally wear it away. I don't think this is going to be the blowout that maybe you would expect from a top 5 or top 10 team. But yeah, it's going to be a curiosity, because what you want to see if you're a Notre Dame fan is Notre Dame should be able to run the ball at will if they're a team that's going to be playoff caliber. And that needs to start showing up, because if they go through this game and they still can't run for, realistically, as a top 10 team, if they want to be a playoff team, they should be running the ball for 7 yards per carry or more against Vanderbilt. And if they're not able to do that, that is a sign of a serious potential problem when they get in the meat of their schedule and something that's going to hold them back for the rest of the season.
In the running game is the thing that separates, to me, Vanderbilt getting blown out and Vanderbilt not, keeping the game close. Because if you look at the teams that just absolutely blew them out of the water last year, except for Missouri, the teams that blew them out, Kentucky, Alabama, and Georgia, all have NFL caliber running backs. Georgia had 3 or 4 NFL caliber running backs. Snell at Kentucky is really good. He'll be in the NFL. Alabama played Damian Harris, Bo Scarborough, already in the NFL, Najee Harris, Josh Jacobs, and Brian Robinson. all of those running backs. That's 5 running backs on that team from last year, all of which will be in the NFL.